Konnichiwa. Konnichiwa. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us. I am extremely delighted to welcome you to a public lecture today by Professor Eric Maskin, the Nobel Laureate in Economic Sciences and the Professor of Economics and Mathematics at Harvard University. Professor Maskin actually works in a field called mechanism design or reverse game theory. And it was really a great honor for me this afternoon when I handed him a copy of my book on mechanism design. So you can imagine how excited and special this moment is. And of course, this special event is co-hosted by United Nations University and the International Peace Foundation, commemorating the 50th anniversary of the official relations between Japan and the ASEAN region. Professor Eric Maskin received the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences in 2007 for laying out the foundations of mechanism design theory, which determines whether it is possible to build institutions or mechanisms in order to achieve specified economic or social goals. His contributions have had a profound impact on economics, public policy, and even as diverse fields as political science and computer science. One of the applications of mechanism design is the work on using a mechanism design to design a kidney exchange market. I would like to call it a rational way of doing it, where the concept of money does not actually exist and should not exist because the ethics do not allow us to do that. And of course, mechanism design actually does help us to do that. As a reminder of the format of today's event, Professor Maskin is going to give a 45-minute lecture, followed by a 45-minute Q&A, which I have the honor to moderate. We have Japanese language simultaneous interpretation available today, so if you prefer to listen to the lecture in Japanese, please use the headsets provided. For those of you who are new to the UN University, allow me to say a few words about this university that I have a privilege of being its leader. United Nations University was established by the UN General Assembly in 1972 and launched its academic work at our Tokyo headquarters in 1975. I have to add, when it was the General Assembly established it in 1972, I was actually 1 year old. So I did not take note of the event because I was too young to do so. Over the decades, UN University expanded and today consists of 13 and soon to be 14 research institutes located in 12 different countries in the Americas, in Europe, in my continent of Africa, and in Asia. We will soon be opening the 14th institute focusing on artificial intelligence in Bologna, in Italy. UN University is an international university that acts as a bridge between the academic research and policy makers in the UN system as well as between academics and policymakers in the global north and the global south. If I were to paraphrase it in the language of the subject of Professor Maskin, the UN university's role is to design mechanisms that connect the global south to the global north, the policy makers and the academics to tackle the global challenges such as sustainable development and climate change. Of course, our research spans across 17 sustainable development goals and a strong and direct influence on the key UN decision-making bodies. So we are the gateway to taking, one of the gateways of taking policy into the international practice arena through the United Nations. Of course, one of our institutes is actually located here in Tokyo. And I can see Yamaguchi, Professor Yamaguchi, who is the head of that institute. And she, of course, this Institute of Advanced Study on Sustainability is actually creating mechanisms to ensure that sustainability is not only a dream, but is a reality. And of course, UNU IAS, under the leadership of Professor Yamaguchi, offers 2 postgraduate degree programs, a 2-year master's degree in sustainability and a 3-year PhD in sustainability science. Both of these programs have opened applications for September 2024 entry. We encourage you to take one of the flyers at the reception desk, as well as check the website of UNU IAS for more information on these programs and how to apply. Inequality seems to be more pervasive than ever. I come from South Africa, and one of the defining features of where I come from, which we need to resolve, is the issue of inequality. It's not sustainable. In fact, the World Bank stated at the end of last year, and I quote, "If 2022 was a year of uncertainty, 2023 is the year of inequality." And of course, some of that inequality comes from what happened during the so-called COVID-19. COVID-19 has made all of us poorer. And many countries are actually just trying to be where they were prior to the pandemic. Indeed, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres recently stated that, and I quote, "Inequality is tearing our world apart. 2024 must be the year when we seize the opportunity to create a more inclusive global economy that works for everyone, everywhere." I will close with a quote from Professor Maskin, and I quote, "Globalization is a force that should be enjoyed by everybody, not just the people at the top. Let the fruits of globalization be shared equally." As a person who owns a farm in South Africa, and when we talk about those fruits you are talking about, Professor Maskin, you are actually right. But we need mechanisms to ensure that that actually happens. I will now ask Uwe Morawetz from our co-hosting organization, the International Peace Foundation, to give a few remarks before we welcome Professor Maskin. Thank you very much.
Yeah, welcome to the Japan-ASEAN Bridges event series, which is facilitated by the Vienna-based International Peace Foundation. The events are hosted in cooperation with various local partners, including some of the country's main universities, and I would like to thank the United Nations University for hosting our event today. Commemorating the 50th anniversary of official relations between Japan and the ASEAN region, Bridges will be continuously held in Japan and Thailand until March, involving the participation of Nobel Laureates for physics, chemistry, medicine, and economics. The Japan-ASEAN Bridges series follows the series of over 800 Bridges events, which the International Peace Foundation has facilitated since 2003 to support education in the ASEAN region. The pluralistic program of Bridges highlights the International Peace Foundation's intercultural and transdisciplinary approach towards peace. The foundation doesn't take sides, but acts as a mediator by creating an independent platform for dialogue where representatives of science, politics, economy, culture, religion, the media and youth can meet, share their viewpoints, listen to each other, and find mutual ways of understanding and cooperation. Therefore, the foundation itself is a bridge and a facilitator between different language groups in our divided societies, where politicians speak another language than artists, and business and religious leaders another one than scientists. In a highly interdependent world, problems cannot be solved by either one of these language groups only, but by working together. The aim of Bridges is to facilitate and strengthen dialogue and communication between societies in Asia with their multiple cultures and faiths, as well as with peoples in other parts of the world, to promote understanding and trust. The events aim at building bridges with local universities in Asia to establish long-term relationships with Nobel laureates in all fields, which result in common research programs and other forms of collaboration. By enhancing science, technology, and education as a basis for peace and development, the events may lead to a better cooperation for the advancement of peace, freedom, and security in the region, with the active involvement of the young generation, Asia's key to the future. This is why Bridges is not designed as a one-time event, but as a continuous process of synergies of now over 2 decades to make the series of events a sustainable success for Asia as a whole. I am grateful to our partners and sponsors who have enabled us to make the idea of Bridges a reality. I would like to thank everyone present today for taking part in this program. May it help us to facilitate a new culture of peace through dialogue, transcending its definition as merely the absence of war or armed conflict, into a new understanding what the basis for peace is: education. In this spirit, we welcome today the 2007 Nobel Laureate for Economics, Professor Maskin, who has agreed to come to Japan to support the events. So we all look forward to his keynote speech and to his important contribution to build bridges. A warm welcome, Professor Maskin.
Well, it's a great pleasure for me to be here today. I've had the opportunity to visit Tokyo many times in the past, but this is my first time at the United Nations University, and many thanks to the university and the International Peace Foundation for making that possible. I'd like to talk this afternoon about an issue which, as the rector mentioned, is one of the most concerning, one of the most divisive in the world today, which is inequality and its connection to globalization. I don't have to tell you it because it's obvious that globalization has been a major force in our lives over the last 20 or 30 years. You have only to go to your local grocery shop to see that it's now possible to get fruit and vegetables, many other products from around the world. And this has certainly enriched our lives and also enriched the countries that we live in. Actually, the aspect of globalization that I would like to concentrate on, though, and this point will be made in more detail in a little while, is that globalization is not only about trade in goods and services, but also about production. An important aspect of the current globalization is that the very process of producing goods has been globalized. Computers, for example, require the inputs, contributions of engineers, software people, factories located around the world. And this will be important to my story. Now, why has globalization occurred? Of course, transport costs, declining transport costs have a lot to do with that, but actually even more important has been the decline in communication costs. It's now virtually costless to talk to people literally around the world, and this has made possible the fact that if I have a company based in New York, I can easily have employees in Tokyo, in London, any place in the world, and I can communicate with them, I can coordinate with them with no problem at all. Now, the proponents of globalization, the advocates of globalization, have made a number of promises on its behalf. One promise, one important promise, is that globalization would bring prosperity to emerging economies. And on this promise, globalization has certainly delivered. If we look at countries like China and India, for example, they have grown enormously in the last 30 years, and most of that growth can be attributed to globalization. China was a poor country 30 or 40 years ago, with one of the lowest per capita incomes around. It now has the second largest economy in the world. It actually replaced Japan in that category. And that success story, as I was saying, is attributable to globalization. Same thing in India. But there's another promise that advocates of globalization made, which has not been delivered on. And that promise was to reduce inequality in emerging economies, to reduce the gap between the rich and the poor, the haves and the have-nots. In fact, just the opposite has happened. We've seen an increase in most emerging economies in inequality that can be directly attributed to an increase in globalization. And in particular, that's happened in China and India. They are more unequal countries than they were a generation ago, even though they are richer countries than they were. Now, I'm going to skip over some of this because what I first want to discuss as an economist is, should we economists be surprised by the fact that inequality has been increasing? And the answer is actually yes, because this increase in inequality contradicts a very well-established theory, a very well-established principle in economics called the theory of comparative advantage, a theory that goes back 200 years and that has been making very successful predictions for over 200 years. And the theory of comparative advantage says that globalization should actually reduce inequality in emerging economies. And because this theory, the theory of comparative advantage, is so important in economics and has been so important in guiding or perhaps misguiding our thinking about globalization, I want to spend a bit of time explaining why comparative advantage would lead to a decrease in inequality. So let me describe the essence of the theory of comparative advantage. It's basically the idea that countries should specialize in producing the sorts of goods that they are particularly well adapted for. Now, what does it mean to be well adapted for producing a particular good? It means that your labor force is well suited for producing that good. I'm going to simplify the story a bit and assume that the labor force consists just of two kinds of workers. There are high-skilled workers, workers who have a great deal of training, a great deal of skill at what they do, and there are low-skill workers who have very little training and perhaps are relying on outmoded ideas for how to produce. And to discuss globalization, I want to make another simplification by just looking at two countries, a rich country and an emerging economy. Now, why is the rich country rich? The rich country is rich because of its labor force. A rich country will have a high proportion of high-skill labor. The ratio of high-skill to low-skill labor is high. And that means that a rich country will have a comparative advantage at producing the sorts of goods that require a lot of high-skill labor. An example falling into this category would be computer software. Computer software requires software engineers, it requires coders. It does not require much low-skill labor at all. So think of computer software as a good for which a rich country is particularly well adapted to produce. The emerging economy is much poorer because its high-skill to low-skill ratio is quite low. And so the emerging economy is well adapted to producing goods where skill really doesn't matter so much. And that tends to be things like agricultural products, such as rice. Now, to understand the effect of globalization on production and on inequality, let's do the following thought experiment. Let's look at the situation before globalization becomes possible. That is, before the rich country and the emerging economy can trade with one another. And let's compare that with how things look after globalization becomes possible, that is, after the two countries are trading. And of course, the difference between those two situations can be attributed to globalization. So let's look first at what happens before trade is possible, before globalization takes place. Before globalization takes place, of course, citizens, consumers in the rich country will want both software and rice. So in order to get this software and rice, companies in the rich country will have to produce both software and rice. Same thing in the emerging economy. There have to be some companies that produce software, there have to be some companies that produce rice in the emerging economy. But there's a sense in which producing software in the emerging economy is inefficient because the labor force in the emerging economy is better adapted to producing rice. And so to the extent that production is being diverted away from rice to software, the labor force is not being used efficiently. In fact, low-skilled workers are actually hurt by the fact that there's this diversion away from rice, because low-skilled workers are needed, seriously needed for rice production, but they're not much needed for software production. So to the extent that it's software that's being produced, the demand for low-skilled labor is being reduced, and therefore the wages for low-skilled workers are being reduced. It's just the opposite. It's just the opposite for the high-skilled workers in the emerging economy. They are very much in demand when it comes to software production, and so they will see their wages rise according to how much software is being produced. So software production is very good for them. Now, that's the story before trade between the two countries becomes possible. But now let's imagine that the door opens and there is trade between the two countries. What will happen? Well, now the rich country no longer needs to produce rice because it can import that rice from the emerging economy. So it can concentrate all its production, or almost all its production, on software. And it can import the rice from the emerging economy. Just the opposite in the emerging economy. It used to be producing software, but it doesn't need to do that anymore. It can import that from the rich country, and it can concentrate on producing rice. Now, that means that compared to the pre-globalization scenario, the emerging economy is producing more rice and less software than before. And This is great for low-skilled workers because, as I said, they aren't really needed much for software. But when production of rice ramps up, that puts low-skilled workers in more demand, and it raises their wages. And just the opposite for high-skilled workers. They were benefiting before from the software production, but now there's much less software production, so the high-skilled workers aren't needed much anymore. Their wages fall, and what do we see happen to inequality in the emerging economy? It declines. The low-skilled worker wages rise, the high-skilled wages fall. There is less inequality than before. What I have just shown you is the standard argument, the argument based on comparative advantage that was given thousands of times when the current period of globalization began, suggesting that globalization would reduce inequality in emerging economies. Now, interestingly, that prediction was correct in all the previous globalizations we had up until the recent one. You have to remember that the current globalization is very far from being the first. There have been 4 or 5 periods of globalization over the last few hundred years. A very important period of globalization took place in the late 19th century, when trade between Europe and North America increased dramatically because of the possibility of cheap shipping across the Atlantic Ocean. And at that point, Europe was the emerging economy, if you like. It was the place where there was relatively little high-skilled labor and an abundance of low-skilled labor. And just as the theory predicts, inequality declines in Europe. But somehow, the current globalization is different from the globalization of the late 19th century. And that's how I got interested in studying the subject. I like intellectual puzzles, and it seemed to me that here we had a very important intellectual puzzle. What is different about this globalization that has made inequality increase by comparison with the previous ones? And so I got together with a former student, Michael Kremer, who's a development economist. I should point out that he's a student I'm very proud of because he himself won the Nobel Prize for his work in development economics a few years ago. I can't take credit for that, but I would like to take credit. Anyway, we got together and we worked out an alternative theory to the theory of comparative advantage. And it's a theory which puts globalized production at the center. Remember, I said at the beginning that globalization doesn't just mean trade in goods and services, it also means the globalization of the production process itself. And to see how globalized production is a hallmark of the current globalization, you only have to think of a good like computers. Computers will have contributions A single computer will have contributions from all around the world. The computer might be designed in the US, programmed in Europe, assembled in China, and computers are only one of literally thousands of products that are truly global in their production process. And that, we claim, is the big difference between today's globalization and previous ones. It's the globalization of production. And I want to try to convince you that globalized production really does make a big difference. And to do that, I can no longer just rely on there being 2 skill levels. I'm actually going to need 4 skill levels. But I'm going to stick with the simplification that I was making before, that there are just the 2 countries, the rich country and the emerging economy. And once again, the reason the rich country is rich is because it has a more highly skilled labor force than the emerging economy. I'm going to label the 4 skill levels as A, B, C, and D. So A is the highest skill, and D is the lowest skill. And the rich country will be assumed to have mostly A and B workers, and the emerging economy will be assumed to have mostly C and D workers. And I need to talk a little bit about the production process itself. Let's imagine that in order to produce anything, a computer, a car, an airplane, you need different tasks to be performed. Because I'm trying to make everything as simple as possible, let me assume that there are just 2 tasks that have to be performed. I'll call one the managerial task, and this is a task which is highly sensitive to skill. And the other I'll call the subordinate task, which is not so sensitive to skill. So the idea is that in order to produce whatever good you're producing, you need to fill 2 tasks. You need to fill the managerial task, you need to fill the subordinate task, and the amount of output that you get will depend on the skill levels of the people occupying or performing those tasks. So this is the only mathematical formula in this talk, and it's a pretty simple one. It just says that output is equal to the skill level of the manager squared, and I'll explain why it's squared in a minute, times the skill level of the subordinate. Now, why is the manager's skill level squared? Actually, this number doesn't have to be a 2. It could be a 3. It could be just about any number bigger than 1. But the point is that if it is bigger than 1, that gets across the idea that the manager's skill level matters more than the subordinate skill level. It's the difference between the 2 that is going to make the difference. So let's imagine that the manager's skill level is 4, the subordinate the subordinate skill level is 3, then according to this formula, we would get outputs of 4 squared, that is 4 times 4, because that's the manager's skill, times 3, the subordinate skill, or 48 in all. Now, the way that workers of different skills are matched together to produce outputs will be determined by the markets and by market forces. To explore this a little bit, let's imagine that we had a labor force that consisted of just 4 different workers. There are two workers of skill level 3 and 2 workers of skill level 4. Well, there are 2 different ways that we could match workers in this labor force together. We could match them this way, where one of the 3 workers is matched with one of the 4 workers. The 4 worker would have the managerial position, the 3 worker would have the subordinate position. If you do the calculation, this kind of matching, which I call cross-matching because we're moving across different skill levels within a particular production operation. So if they're matched this way, we get 48 from this production process here, and another 48 from this one, adding up to 96. But the other way that we could match workers together is this way. We could match one of the 4 workers with the other 4 worker, and one of the 3 workers with the other 3 worker, and this would give us a grand total of 91. Now 96 is bigger than 91, so in this example, we would expect to have cross-matching, because cross-matching gives rise to more outputs. And producers, in a market scenario, are going to want to maximize outputs given the available inputs, which are the workers. But we don't necessarily always get cross-matching. We do in this example, but here's another example where instead of having 2 3 workers and 2 4 workers, we have 2 2 workers and 2 4 workers. So the lower skilled people's skills are lower than before. Once again, we can compare cross-matching with homogeneous matching. Homogeneous matching is where all of the workers in a particular company or in a particular production operation have the same skill. Now we get this kind of matching rather than cross-matching as producing more output, 72 versus 64. So all of this is to illustrate that the kind of matching we get is going to depend on the labor force available to us. And the labor force available to us is going to be changed by globalization. So let me go back to our 2 countries. Remember, the rich country has skill levels A and B. The poor country has skill levels C and D. And let's do the same sort of thought experiment that I did before with the theory of comparative advantage. Let's look at the world before globalization and compare that with the world after globalization. Well, before globalization, it is impossible to hire workers from two different countries. That requires more coordination than can be accomplished in a pre-communication revolution world. So in the rich country, we're going to see domestic matches, but we're not going to see any of the workers in the rich country being matched with workers in the emerging economy. So the labor force that a company in the rich country has to work with is entirely domestic. And the same thing in the developing country, in the emerging economy. But globalization changes all of that. Globalization means that as a company, you can hire workers anywhere in the world. And so we're going to get a picture that looks like this. Now, I have the A workers matched with other A workers and the D workers matched with other D workers. Actually, that's not the important part. The important part is right in the middle, where we've got B workers in the rich country being matched with C workers from the emerging economy. Importantly, D workers are not being matched with workers in the rich country at all. It's only the C workers. And that's a critical distinction, because to have the opportunity of working with B workers someplace else in the world is a new opportunity for C workers, which is bound to raise their incomes. If you have more job opportunities, chances are your income, your wage is going to go up. So the C workers get some excellent new job opportunities. They don't have to move to another country. They can stay where they are. If you're a Chinese worker, you can work for Apple without moving to California. That's where good communication comes in. But my point is that the C workers get these new job opportunities and see their incomes rise. The D workers don't have high enough skills to offer anything to the global market, and so they're left to fend for themselves. They do not see their incomes rise. And now you see what the source of inequality is. It's globalization gives job opportunities to the C workers and not to the D workers. Now, what are the implications? What are the implications of this theory, this alternative theory? Well, of course, if inequality is being created by globalization, one response would be, oh, we should stop globalization because it's a source of inequality. I think that would be a big mistake, because as I was suggesting at the beginning, globalization has very successfully been an engine for increased prosperity in many emerging economies. If we were to end globalization or curtail it, that would end the engine for prosperity. A better solution is to keep globalization, but to do something directly about the inequality by allowing D-workers to have exciting, lucrative job matchings as well. They were left out of the picture on the previous slide, but if we are able to raise their skill sufficiently through education, through job training, then they will be able to participate in the global labor force. They will have new opportunities, and that will help to fight the inequality that was created. The problem, of course, is that education and job training are expensive. They don't come for free. Someone has to pay for them, and who's going to do that? Well, the D-workers themselves can't afford to pay for education and job training. We're talking about some of the poorest people in the world. So we can't expect them to invest in their own skill elevations. But we probably also can't expect the producers, the employers, to do this either, because they don't have the incentive to do it. If you are a potential employer for me, say I'm a D worker, and you're thinking of hiring me, well, in order to hire me, you're going to have to give me some job training because I don't have enough skill to work profitably for you without training. So you could give me the training, but once I have that training, I don't have to work for you. I can go to work for your competitor, in which case your investment in me is lost. So that suggests that employers do not have sufficient incentive to solve the inequality problem. They do not have sufficient incentive to invest in skill training of D workers. And that means that we cannot expect a purely market-oriented solution to the inequality problem. The market is not going to solve the problem on its own. The workers can't do it, and the employers don't have the incentive to do it. So someone else has to pay. And who is the obvious someone else? I maintain that it's government. If the government in an emerging economy is serious about ending inequality, it has to make an investment in the worker skill. Now, it doesn't have to do the training itself. It could, for example, give employers a tax break if they hire and train D workers. And if these companies get a tax break, then the fact that the workers may go off and work for someone else doesn't matter as much, because at least they're having their taxes reduced. Or the government can subsidize in some other way a company that is willing to undertake the training of D workers. But the point is that something like that is necessary if we're going to expect inequality in emerging economies to decline. We cannot expect it to happen automatically. So that brings me to a simple conclusion from all of this. If we're going to deal with inequality, and I think we have to deal with inequality because, once again, the rector pinpointed the problem. It is extremely divisive. It makes the world a less stable place. Any country with extremely high inequality is in danger of falling apart, and we've seen countries fall apart as a result of inequality. So simply for the sake of holding the political and social fabric together, we have to deal with inequality. But if we're going to deal with inequality, there are two ways we could proceed. One would be to try to stop the forces of globalization. That's not so easy to do, but I would maintain that even if we could do that, we wouldn't want to, because globalization really does elevate a country on average, even if it doesn't elevate everybody by the same amount. The right course of action, I maintain, is to keep globalization, but to adjust it to allow D workers, the lowest skilled workers of all, to enjoy the fruits of globalization like everyone else. Thank you very much.
I think let's give the professor another round of applause. So this is the time at which we open the floor for discussions. But before then, I actually have quite one or two problems. Questions that I will ask the professor. I think the first one is on automation. What is the impact on automation on inequality and on maybe the concept of competitive advantage? Does it change what makes us have a competitive advantage, and how do we deal with that to deal with issues of inequality?
Well, those are excellent questions, and you won't be surprised to hear that economists have been very interested in trying to answer those questions. On the first part, what is the effect of automation and new technology in general, I would say, on inequality? The answer actually depends on the time scale you look at. On a relatively short time scale, historically, new technology has tended to increase inequality, make it worse. And that has been true not only in the recent past, but going all the way back to the early 19th century. The early 19th century was a very interesting period from from an economist or an engineer standpoint, because it was the first period in history where there was a tremendous increase in labor-saving technology. It was called the Industrial Revolution, and it really was a revolution. And the immediate effect of the Industrial Revolution was to put many, many millions of people, mostly low-skill people, out of work. Because machines could do what they were doing better. But after a period of time, entrepreneurs figured out clever ways of taking relatively low-skilled people and machines and combining them, say, on the assembly line, in very productive combinations, so that even relatively low-skilled people now became much more productive than they had been. And we saw actually an increase, thanks to automation, in demand for low-skilled labor. And over the course of the 19th century, we saw the fastest and the most pronounced increase in wages that had ever been seen in history. So the short-run effect was to increase inequality, but the longer-term effect, because of the increase in low-skill wages, was to reduce inequality. Now, what has happened more recently, we've had a great deal of technological innovation in recent years, and once again, the immediate effect has been a decline in equality, an increase in inequality. We've seen inequality, even in rich countries, increase dramatically because relatively low-skilled people lose their jobs. However, if historical experience is any guide, we should expect entrepreneurs eventually to get into the act and figure out how to use these displaced workers more productively. And I think there's cause for optimism that eventually automation, once again, will be a force for less inequality. But there's one complication about the current technological revolution by comparison with the original Industrial Revolution, and that is that some forms of automation, and this particularly involves AI, cause not just low-skilled people, but high-skilled people to lose their jobs. That's the novel thing about AI, that it's not just, say, taxi drivers who will lose their jobs to self-driving cars, but radiologists who read X-rays. At this point, AI can read those X-rays almost as well, and soon they will be reading X-rays better than any radiologist. Same thing is true in law. We're getting AI systems which can compose legal briefs better than any lawyer. That fact, of course, makes high-skilled workers a little bit nervous. And it does mean that there's something different about the current technological revolution, but we don't really yet know exactly how that will play into inequality.
Well, I mean, just before I have one more question before I open the floor. Please bear with me. It's somewhat controversial. Is your thinking around IP and innovation?
Yeah.
One of the things that is pretty clear is that IP does also inhibit our fight of climate change. For example, if we take issues of solar energy, it is clear that if you give that technology, access to that technology to 80% of the population, then we are better off. What are your views? The relationship between IP, innovation, and climate change, and what can we do about it?
Once again, a very good question. I'm a little bit more skeptical of IP, intellectual property, than some of my colleagues, exactly because I worry that it interferes with innovation. You see, if you invent something and you patent it, of course that protects you against other people being able to copy the idea, and that might be important because perhaps you've made a big investment of money, of energy, of time, which naturally you want to recoup. And if people can simply copy your innovation, you may not be able to recoup the investment. But so that's the positive side of IP. But the negative side is that if you have this patent, so I can't imitate you, I also can't use your innovation for important social purposes. So if I'm a poor country and I want to use your solar battery, for example, for providing power, I can't do that without paying you a royalty, and I might not be able to afford that royalty. So because of the second effect, I am more skeptical about the value of IP than many of my colleagues. But being a mechanism design economist, I understand that you have to have incentives to develop these things in the first place. So I favor a system in which valuable patents, valuable discoveries are bought out. So if you've made a great contribution and you get a patent on it, you deserve to be rewarded for that contribution, but that's something that the government can do. They can buy out your patents, put it into the public domain, and then everybody can use your great discovery for their purposes. That's the sort of response I would like to see more of.
No, thanks. I'm going to open the door for questions. As you are raising your hands, the idea of government, a mechanism of government, is obviously an ideological issue. Number one, number two, number three, number four. Where is number five? Number five, I think we are going to stop at number five, and if we have time, we'll go to other numbers. So please introduce yourself first and where you are based, and then you can ask your question.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Jure Rifel. I'm the ambassador of Slovenia to Japan, but I'm going to speak in personal capacity, so don't quote me. This is not a position of my country. It's like, thank you very much for this excellent presentation about inequality. Especially, this is a very pertinent issue. I come from a country where we have the second lowest Gini coefficient among the OECD member states, so we understand how important is that for the social cohesion and the productivity as such of the national economy and society. It was very well pointed out the importance of the, if I say so, acquiring additional skills in order for the labor that is not skilled enough that can enter the labor market, and here a responsibility of the domestic government, which is good. But on the other hand, don't you think that maybe there should be also corporate responsibility? That there should be maybe some international guidelines, maybe even standards of a corporate responsibility in these emerging economies, how to stimulate, how to boost this development of labor market in terms of acquiring higher skill levels. Thank you.
I certainly agree that if you could make companies, corporations feel responsible for training what I've called D workers, that would be terrific. I'm not altogether confident that it's so easy to make them feel responsible. I mean, perhaps you can do it through international guidelines. Perhaps you can shame them into doing it by making them look irresponsible socially if they don't do it. And certainly you should try to do that. But in the end, I'm not sure if that is going to be enough. It's similar to the response that we see on climate change. Climate change is another big social problem, and you can shame companies into reducing their carbon footprint. You can shame citizens into reducing their carbon footprint, but that's never going to be enough to solve the climate change problem. It might be a useful contribution, but it's not going to be enough. What would be enough, again, is if government gets into the act and starts imposing carbon taxes. We know what the mechanism ought to be for solving climate change. It's impose a carbon tax so that if you emit carbon, you pay for the damage that you create. That would be a revolution overnight if we could get carbon taxes through. Making individuals and companies feel responsible can help, but it's not the answer by itself.
Number 2.
My name is Hélio Sifoni. I'm from Brazil, from the private sector. Our company works in offices in Singapore, in Japan, in China, and in the Mercosur area. And my question is something related to the low-skill labor training and the relation we have with globalization, with the human traffic and the new models of slavery. That's it. Thank you.
I'm not sure I entirely caught the question. What is...
The question is globalization and the relation with human traffic and the new models of slavery. So if we are not training the low-skilled people in very poor countries,
Mm-hmm.
and if there is a relationship with this, what we see as human trafficking, and mainly to rich countries from the very poor countries. So
I see.
Yep.
Right. So yeah, no, I think there is a connection. Say that I live imagine that I live in an emerging economy, but maybe a very poor economy, and I don't have skills. Well, I'm not going to be able to get a decent job unless someone is willing to train me. So what am I going to do? Well, I might be desperate in my home country and try to go someplace else where at least I can get a reasonable job. And that's what I think you were referring to. A lot of the international migration we see these days is out of economic desperation. You can't really survive in your home country, so you try to go someplace else where you can survive. A much better answer to the problem of this desperation than forcing people to move around is to train them. And if the domestic governments aren't willing to do it, well, that's a role for international organizations. That's something that the UN could get involved in. The UN wouldn't be paying for it themselves, but they could organize a consortium of countries that would be willing to pay for job training. Let me give you an example of a UN consortium that actually has worked very well, and that's on providing vaccines against pneumococcal disease. There are a number of very poor African countries where hundreds of thousands of people die from lung infections. Drug companies in the West know how to produce vaccines against these pneumococcal diseases, but they didn't have the incentive to produce them because who was going to pay? Who was going to pay for the vaccines? So the UN, much to its credit, came to the rescue and organized a vaccine fund into which rich countries would pay, and then that money could be used to pay drug companies that had developed vaccines for their vaccines, which were then distributed. I've seen figures that many hundreds of thousands of lives have been saved as a result of this initiative, and there's no reason why a similar idea couldn't be used for job training, to give people in very poor countries skills that would enable them to have decent lives.
Number 3.
Thank you, Professor, for the lecture. My name is Achille, PhD student in sustainability at the Tokyo University of Foreign Studies. I understood from your lecture that globalization has certainly helped countries like China or India, but I would like to speak from the perspective of the Global South in general. So I would like your opinion. In the historical development of globalization, there was what they call the Structural Adjustment Program and the Washington Consensus as well. So I'd like to know if you think maybe these, the Bretton Woods institutions have affected, negatively, the emerging economies' economic growth as a reason why globalization has failed to reduce inequality. Thank you.
Again,
the question is
I want to make sure I'm clearly understanding your question. Are you saying that maybe globalization wasn't such a good idea for developing countries after all?
No, just your opinion. I mean, in the historical development, because trying to understand the divide. I mean, the global south and the global north. So I just want to know if the structural adjustment program and also the policies put in place by Bretton Woods institutions affected the economy,
right?
Say the emerging economies. Performance. So that's my question.
Yeah.
So you're saying were those mechanisms effective? in addressing?
I think they were effective. Yes, that is, if you look at inequality across countries today, as compared to across countries 30 years ago, there is actually less inequality. So emerging economies, thanks to these changes, they have caught up to some extent. So there's less inequality than before. The problem is that within the developing country, within the emerging economy, most of the benefit of that improvement has not gone to D-workers. It's gone to people with skills, so that although the country as a whole is better off as a result of globalization and structural reform, the distribution of benefits has been very lopsided. And that's what I think needs to be corrected. That, we live in an age where globalization is under threat. If you listen to politicians, if you listen to the general discussion, we're in a sort of anti-globalist period. And that is because globalization did not pay sufficient attention, or the people pushing globalization did not pay sufficient attention to the people who were being left behind by globalization. If the sorts of things that I'm talking about, such as job training, education, had been thought of 30 years ago or implemented 30 years ago, we would not, I think, be in such an anti-globalist age. And politicians like Donald Trump, who have built their careers on being anti-globalist, would not have been allowed to prosper. So there's quite a lot at stake by doing something about inequality. It's not just for the sake of the people, the D workers themselves. It's for the sake of our whole system that it's important to try to correct inequality.
Thank you. And number 4.
Hello. Yeah, my name is Amit. I'm based in Tokyo. I'm in private sector. So my question is basically in your last slide, you mentioned that there are policy implications for the government because those who are actually left behind, they have to be trained. So my question is, where does the government get budget for that? Does it expect that in general the economy would grow and it will get extra budget for that? And what are also the political implications? For example, if the government is not spending enough for upskilling those who are left behind, does that in any way indicate or give some kind of explanation why there are, in many countries, there is strong, trained in politicians who are populists and all that. So that's my
right.
question. Thank you.
So what you've pointed at is a big problem in political life. There are many things you could spend your government revenue on, and how do you prioritize? If you're spending more on job training, you're presumably spending less on something else. I would argue that skill training, elevating skills, should be a top priority for almost any emerging economy. There's really nothing more important, in my view, than making investments in people themselves, what economists call human capital. And so if this has to come at the expense of some infrastructure, building roads and bridges, I would often argue that that we should make that trade-off. Having another building might be good, but having another skilled worker is even better. So that's the answer to part of your question. Now, you were asking about populists, like Donald Trump, for example. But there are populists everywhere now. We live in an anti-globalist and populist era. I am sympathetic to populists in the sense that they have identified more clearly than the globalists that there's a problem out there, and that people have been left behind by globalization. So to give credit where credit is due, I do salute the populists for that. What I don't like about populists is that they don't offer meaningful solutions. Often their solution is to end globalization. That is not a solution. And so I hope that now that the world has been woken up to the threat of populism, and the threat is that we will have leaders who are not solving problems and who have authoritarian inclinations. Now that we recognize this threat, more serious politicians who can provide answers will step in and actually do something about inequality.
The last question, number 5.
Hello, Professor Maskin. Thank you so much for a very insightful lecture. I indeed had a lot to take away from it, and I enjoyed it a lot. I'm an undergraduate. I'm a freshman studying at Waseda University here in Tokyo. And now that you have mentioned issues about globalization and equality, my question is regarding equity. Professor Maskin, in what ways is globalization intertwined with the issue of equity? And so as an economist, how do you think investment in human resources such as education be implemented in order to tackle the issues of lack of equity in this society right now?
Well, if by equity you mean there not being huge disparities in income and in wealth, I hope that my presentation elaborated the link between equity or inequity and globalization. Globalization tends to aggravate inequities by giving only some people good job opportunities and not others. Now, of course, the problem with inequity in education extends well beyond the inequities that were created by globalization. In many countries, the quality of education you can get depends very much on the family you come from. If you come from a well-to-do family, you'll get a fine education. If you don't, then you may get quite a poor education or no education at all. And there again, I think governments can help correct these inequities. I've been impressed by the use in some Latin American countries of what are called conditional cash transfers. In many countries, a large fraction of the population is involved in what we call subsistence agriculture, where you have a farm or you work on a farm, you are using techniques which allow you to subsist yourself, but you're not even producing enough to be able to sell large quantities on the market. And farms like that require everybody in the family to participate. So in particular, parents can't afford to send their children to school because the children are needed to work on the farm just so that the family can survive. That's where conditional cash transfers come in. The idea is that the government will give a family with children a cash payment in exchange for the family sending their children to school. And so this cash payments helps break the cycle of poverty, helps break the cycle of inequality, because by going to school, the children do acquire skills which enable them to move beyond the subsistence farm where they grew up. I think this is a very clever policy and the kind of policy that we need more of in order to solve the inequities of education beyond those that were created by globalization.
Thank you very much. We have come to the end of this session. I think we can give the professor another resounding round of applause.
Thank you.